Appreciate you all as always. All right, let's get into Andrew Huberman now. I've kept you all in suspense long enough. So we're going to start out with this TikTok from a fantastic TikTok creator.
Let's talk about
that was sent to me by our boy Sebastian in the Discord group chat, or the Discord Stream React channel. So if you want to join our Discord, just become a $1 patron. That's all it takes is $1 Patreon supporter for 1 month, and then we'll never kick you out of the Discord chat. You can be in it for life. So become a Patreon supporter to join our Discord, and then you can send me stuff in the Stream React suggestions, and I respond to at least 60-70% of it. You know, that's really where I get a lot of the videos for the Power Hour that we react to. So this was sent to us in the Discord by Sebastian, by this fantastic user who, again, I didn't know of, called Slugtown. And it seems like they have a background in neuroscience, because their critiques here are pretty deep and are pretty solid. So it also seems like they're an anti-capitalist. Like, if they're not coming at this from a Marxist perspective, they're at least coming at it from an anti-capitalist perspective, which you have to do, dude. You have to do. This is the one thing. I mean, I learned a lot of things from studying healthcare administration in grad school. But the main thing I learned is that if you don't have a Marxist or if you don't have an anti-capitalist perspective, it's impossible to understand the current field of healthcare, the current field of science. Like, so much stuff is infected or influenced by the market, by capital, by the major corporations that control these industries or that fund scientific research, right? Science can't just be objective under capitalism, right? It can't just be an objective analysis of the world. The kind of science that gets published, the kind of research that gets done, the kind of even sometimes the conclusions that they come to are going to be influenced by money. They're going to be influenced by capital. They're going to be influenced by the market itself. So this is a great example of that. And this is someone who seems to be privy to that, whereas Andrew Huberman is absolutely not.
The politics of the dopamine mythos. There are two major players that I see spreading this dopamine mythos. One is Anna Lemke.
So she's explicitly talking about the politics of this obsession with dopamine. Yeah, and we know as dialectical materialists, as dialecticians, that everything in this world is interconnected. And, you know, there are relationships between things. And if you offset one of the things, it might change another one of the things. So basically what I'm saying is that if you isolate dopamine, if you only look at dopamine and say dopamine is all we're going to focus on in terms of human happiness, human productivity, human flourishing, you're missing a lot of other factors that relate to dopamine, whether external factors or internal chemical factors.
Lemke, a Stanford psychiatrist who wrote the book Dopamine Nation that came out last year, and her colleague at Stanford, Andrew Huberman, a neuroscientist who has maybe the most popular health and self-improvement podcast right now and loves to talk about dopamine.
If anyone out there is feeling underwhelmed and kind of like life is no good, etc., chances are your dopamine system has been pushed too hard.
I think it's really important to look at where these two professionals are coming from. Huberman was born and raised in Palo Alto and has his own lab at Stanford, and Lemke runs Stanford's addiction medicine clinic. Her book is based around case studies of her patients, and two of her main characters are wealthy men who work in Silicon Valley. Palo Alto, the suburb of San Francisco where Stanford is located, was built by Leland Stanford in the 1800s when he was trying to move his family away from the workers who were protesting outside of his house. Stanford was obsessed with racehorses.
Isn't that perfect? What a perfect origin story for Stanford. He was trying to move away from the workers who were rioting outside of his house because he was pushing them so hard.
And he developed something called the Palo Alto system.
Leland Stanford and Charles Marvin, his head horse trainer, were looking for a new way to train the youngest, fastest horses in the world. And this is how Palo Alto really starts, is as a horse stock farm. And that Palo Alto system, where they're applying new kinds of science and profit-directed tools to create life and monitor the production of life, underlies Palo Alto, even if people don't know that history.
Led by infamous eugenicist David Star Jordan, Stanford University became a West Coast center for eugenics. They were obsessed with figuring out how to optimize the population and identify people who had good genes. Malcolm Harris actually says in this interview that if you go to Stanford now, you'll see a bunch of really tall people because being tall was supposed to be a mark of good genes. And in the 50s, the college had to special order 7-foot beds for their incoming freshmen because they were selecting for height. Anyway, this is where
people put too much emphasis on genetics in general too. Like, genetics do matter. Your genetic makeup does matter, but the fitness industry talks about it like it's the end all be all. Right. And I guess if you're bodybuilding, right, like the difference between the top bodybuilders is so small. A lot of times it is, in fact, genetic. But like the new epigenetic research is showing that your genetics will literally change based on your activity. Like if you work out a lot, your DNA will literally change and you will pass on that workout gene to your kids. This is what the field of epigenetics is showing. And this goes back to like what the Soviet Union was looking at when they were trying to make a dialectical analysis of the human genome and genetics back in the day. And they were mocked by Western scientists for thinking that the genes could change based on, your environment and your activity. But that's what new epigenetic research is showing. And it goes the same for negative traits. Like if you're an alcoholic, you can possibly pass that on to your kids. But genes are malleable. Humans are malleable. And the idea that even, your genetics are set in stone isn't entirely true. And you would have to work out repeatedly for 7 years before your genome starts to change and before you could pass that on to your kid. But it can change. And, I do think this hyper obsession with genetics that we have in Western society is an undialectical way to look at genetics, right? It's the idea that you just are what you're born as. You are this individual that you're born as, and you inherit these genes, and there's nothing you can really do to change it, and there's nothing that your environment can do to change it. It's the liberal idea that human nature is stagnant. We can't ever have socialism because of human nature, when the Marxist view is that human nature is malleable. Human nature changes with different environments, and that's what's shown by reality. And I do think this hyper obsession with genetics that exists in liberal society in a lot of ways is rooted in eugenics and is rooted in eugenics research to try and maximize the human genes, when in reality to maximize human genes, what we should try and do is just create the most positive environment that we can for people. Create an environment where people's needs are taken care of and where they have opportunities to flourish and opportunities to develop themselves and opportunities to spend time with family. And, this will impact the genome in a positive way, according to the newest epigenetic research. But these eugenicists say, no, let's just kill off the people with the bad genomes. Or, some people are born to be on top and some people are born to be on bottom. It's all about the genetics. It's stupid. It's just liberalism. It's liberalism being read into genetic science, or being pushed into genetic science.
Where the modern IQ test comes from, the Stanford Binet intelligence test. It was a way to identify human potential at a young age and optimize human beings in much the same way Leland Stanford did with his baby racehorses. Through a critical disability lens, I see the word optimize as pretty much always a red flag, marking deeper eugenic roots. Optimization is always about getting the most profit and productivity out of your workers. In the early 20th century, this optimization...
And that is so true, right? And that's what I see in all of Huberman stuff too. It's not how do you optimize your life, it's how do you use dopamine and optimize your own chemicals to work as much as you can, to grind as much as you can, to be in the workplace focused, creating all that money for your boss, and then going to bed on time so you can get enough rest and wake up and do it again. It's all within the framework of a capitalist work week. How do I maximize my dopamine to not want to jump out a window during the workday when I'm alienated and being exploited? My uncle thinks Huberman can solve all my issues, and maybe you could show your uncle this video, but it works the opposite way too, where then all of Huberman's advice for increasing your dopamine levels, it's stuff that's really, 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 really difficult for people who have a 9-to-5 job to do, or for people who work all day and have a family to do. Like I've told Noah, Noah the carpenter who works for Midwestern Marx, or with Midwestern Marx, one of our directors here at the Institute. He has to wake up every day at like 4 or 5 a.m. if he wants to read and write before he goes to work at like 5:30. And he was having problems with memory and problems with focus. I'm like, well, Andrew Huberman says go outside and stare at the sun. He's like, dude, the sun's not out at 4 a.m., right? And I don't really have time to go stare at the sun for 30 minutes. I got to get my kid to school and go to work and, do all these things that a normal working class person does. So I've taken a lot of Huberman's advice. I've implemented a lot of Huberman's things in my daily schedule. But I don't have a 9-to-5 job, right? I'm not working like a lot, most Americans are. And it's like, if you have limited time in a day, if you're exploited at work and alienated for 8 hours a day, when you come home, and I think of Noah when I think about this, you're going to want to spend time with your kid, or you're going to want to spend time with your family. But Huberman's like, no, get in an ice bath, sit in an ice bath for 30 minutes like Joe Rogan, who also doesn't have a real job, and then get out of the ice bath and your dopamine will be shot up so you can work more, so you can ignore your kids and keep working. And him and, as you'll see later, Jordan Peterson are totally against any kind of quick hits of dopamine, right? And they badmouth social media, TikTok, and they're like, these are just quick hits of dopamine that don't take any effort, so they're bad. It's like, well, what about being with your family? What about hanging out with your kids? That gives you dopamine and serotonin, and you don't really have to work for it. Is that bad? I mean, according to this capitalist framework where humans are just designed to keep their dopamine peaked so they can work all day, yeah. I mean, and Huberman doesn't have a family, I don't believe, or a wife, for what it's worth. He's just a robot.
And was top down. Organizational.
Thank you so much, Apolitical Idealist, for the $2 super chat. I appreciate that.
Psychologists researched ways that managers could impose this on their workers. But since the 1980s, when Reagan and Thatcher shifted government policy toward individual responsibility by deregulating industries and cutting social safety nets, sometimes called neoliberal austerity, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, we've been encouraged to internalize the striving for optimization and do it to ourselves in order to keep up in the workforce. Enter Dopamine Nation. Anna Lembke's book is essentially a thinly veiled rehash of the Protestant work ethic for the neuroscience age. And I know this because she's done a ton of interviews with Christian pastors where she basically admits it.
Of course, the Bible talks about the morality of all of this, and that's essential. And of course, through the lens of religion, that's how we understand what we are now understanding through neuroscience. They're converging and coming together.
Her book demonizes pleasure and valorizes suffering. Lemke suggests that we've become too soft.
So really here, there's no critique of the system, right? It's taking as a given that we live in capitalism, that our current system is what it is. Now, how do we maximize, how do we optimize workers in this system? How do we optimize the process of production so that the workers are producing as much value per second, per minute as they possibly can for the owners, right? So there's no questioning, maybe humans aren't made to work 40 hours a week, right? Maybe the fact that we don't have enough dopamine to stay laser focused 40 hours a week shows that the work week shouldn't be 40 hours a week. But when it comes to these neuroscientists who work within the framework of capital, who work within the framework of the system that we currently exist in, there's no critiquing the system, kind of like Jordan Peterson's psychology. There's no criticizing the system or wondering, what systems came before it and how humans' brains operated in those systems, or how humans' brains operated in primitive communism before class society even came about, right? There's none of that. It's just, how do we maximize people's dopamine when they're at work so that they can focus for the boss, and so that they're not so depressed that they, start leaning towards suicidal thoughts and tendencies. And I see Jamie talking about Adderall and drugs that boost dopamine levels and give your dopaminergic system a stimulating shot. We're going to talk about that a little bit later too, because I mean, really, if the whole goal is to, and Huberman says that he's against Adderall, right? He says he's against ultimately, like, he's not against it being prescribed and it being used by people who need it. He says he's not, but you know, ultimately he kind of claims to be against it, claims to be against pharmacological intervention, when if you're advocating for people to just spike their dopamine as high as they possibly can, there's nothing that's going to do that more than a pill, right? You can take as many cold showers as you want. The maximum that you're going to boost your dopamine is 2.5%. Adderall boosts your dopamine by 10 times. Right. So really his framework of analysis that's just aimed at boosting dopamine so people can be good worker bees is pro Adderall and is pro pharmaceutical industry. And I don't really think it makes sense that he claims that he's against these drugs being used on a mass scale. But, you know, and my view on it is with the current system that we have, you know, if you are someone who has to work 40 hours a week, 60 hours a week, whatever it is, in order to get by, and you need Adderall or you need a pill to do that, of course, you know, I wish in an ideal world, you know, less people would have to take these drugs. But if you needed to get by under our current system, and it doesn't look like our current system's changing anytime soon, you know, take what you need to survive. That's my view on it. But socialism can't solve suffering. Antinatalism bad. Socialism can't completely solve suffering, but it can solve a lot of the contradictions that we have here, and it can massively decrease the human work week. They can make it so humans are no longer trapped in the rat race, and that will lead to a lot of human flourishing and a lot of innovation. Right, but there will always be human suffering, of course. Thank you again, political idealist.
Now, and she wonders why in a country where we have everything we need, we're still so sick and depressed. And her answer to that question is that we've been devouring ourselves, getting too much instant gratification without having to work for it. Huberman has made similar claims. Here he is having a good old time with Jordan Peterson.
One of the absolutely pathologic situations for any animal or human is to be able to access repeated dopamine surges without effort.
Don't sacrifice.
I disagree entirely with this thesis. I think it's really out of touch. Overconsumption is not a personal problem. It's literally just how a capitalist system works. And
exactly. You know what happens if there aren't people to consume all of the stuff that capitalists put out? If not enough people buy the capitalist stuff, the whole system crashes. The whole system breaks. The capitalists are no longer able to produce surplus value, and they're no longer able to keep their operations going because they're not making enough money through their sales. And they'll crash. And the whole system will come crashing down if we all just stop buying things tomorrow. Right? So this is how the system works. The system mass produces these things. And sells them to us. And I think there is a problem with that. There is a problem with overconsumption, right? But it's not a problem that lies with the individual. If you are an individual, yeah, you should try and take breaks from social media. You should try and put it aside. But it's being thrown in our faces. It's being marketed to us constantly. You need the new iPad. You need the new iPhone. You need these new apps. And if you don't buy them, like I said, if people don't buy them en masse, the whole system literally breaks, right? But you'll never hear Huberman or Peterson saying that's what's wrong with our system, right? It's all, this is what's wrong with individuals. They're just lazy sheep and they just want to consume. Well, yeah, people are going to consume when the people who rule society are telling them consume. But can't critique that. Capitalism's the best system. We can never, ever question it. But if capitalism affects individuals negatively, you should yell at those individuals and tell them they're not working hard enough as they're being exploited 40 to 60 hours a week.
And a lot of people in this country do not have everything they need, but I think Huberman and Lemke's position in one of the richest cities in the US may be skewing their perspectives on this. Palo Alto also has one of the highest youth suicide rates in the country, and while Huberman and Lemke might attribute this to dopamine overload.
Yeah, the children of very wealthy people who are overindulged, I've seen that many times, and it is a very sad sight.
Yeah, well, they're not optimally deprived, eh?
A less cruel explanation is that these Palo Alto kids are under immense pressure for high-octane achievement, which makes a lot of sense considering they live in the shadow of a university that, for the last century, has treated children like a prized stock of racehorses. This kind of stress to achieve or...
Right. I think there's a lot of explanations for the raising rates of depression and suicide. And this is what I mean when I say that Peterson and Huberman's view of things like this is undialectical. They are isolating the dopamine chemical and only asking themselves, only talking about depression in the framework of dopamine, this one chemical. When there are many, many, many chemicals in the brain and many, many external or environmental factors that affect your brain chemistry. Right? But rather than look at the system or rather than look at how these chemicals interact, they just say, how do we maximize dopamine? Right? Oh, these people are depressed. They just need to, change their diets and take an ice bath in the morning and stare at the sun when they wake up. And all of a sudden they won't be depressed anymore. Right? They'll be able to work and work and work and work and just be happy. And I don't think that's true. I think this lady has a much more dialectical analysis of what's causing depression. Mainly that these people are stuck in the rat race, and all they see ahead of them is a future of working to try and maintain their family's empire or get ahead, with no enjoyment. All right, let's go back to what we said earlier. Something that increases serotonin or even increases dopamine, increases your feel-good chemicals, being with family, right? Community, being together. And Peterson and Huberman claim to be against any activities that provide instant gratification, but those are healthy activities that provide instant gratification. Healthy activities that you can't partake in if you're at work 60 to 80 hours a week, right? If you're on the grind the whole time. And is the solution to spend less time with your family so you can get in an ice bath in the morning and work harder for your boss? No, the solution is to decrease work hours and allow people to spend more time with their family, to prop up more societal institutions that encourage community, that encourage being together, which, has been shown scientifically to increase human happiness, as has being outside in nature, right? It's been shown that going for a walk in the woods and being around what's called the biosphere, meaning just nature, trees and plants, increases serotonin and increases human happiness, right? But Peterson and even Huberman just ignore these things so they can isolate the dopamine chemical, the go chemical, the work chemical. That's what it's all about for these capitalist scientists.
Even just to make enough money to survive, which we're all under to varying degrees, is something that people want to dissociate from. So we do drugs and we binge Netflix.
Yes, and sorry if I didn't explain what the dopamine chemical was. Nam Trin says, isn't maximizing dopamine supposed to keep you calm and focused on your work, like taking Adderall? So you just keep grinding and being a good worker bee. Yes, that's what, and they frame everything, including combating depression, through the lens of dopamine, right? This chemical that keeps you focused, that keeps you working, that keeps you being a worker bee. That keeps it so when you're at work, you're just thinking about the work you're doing and not thinking about your family at home or your friends or other things like that. So when these guys frame everything through the lens of dopamine and ignore all the other chemicals or external factors that affect brain chemistry, they're basically just encouraging people to work harder and then do what it takes to increase dopamine so they're less depressed when they're at work, right? It's an individualistic way of combating alienation and exploitation. Just take an ice bath before work. Just go stare at the sun before work. Many things which are extremely difficult to do if you actually work, if you actually have a 9 to 5. Female Rage, thank you for the $5 super chat. I'm feeling disillusioned because my coworkers are so petty and underhanded to curry favor with the boss. How do I feel class solidarity with such snakes? Well, you have to get them thinking like a class. This is the problem with a lot of Americans is they buy into the rat race that I just got to get ahead. I just got to do more than my coworkers and suck up to the boss and eventually I'll get rich. You have to build relationships with your coworkers till they trust you and show them over time that that's not how it works, right? That your boss is not looking out for you. Your boss is trying to keep your wage as low as you possibly can. So And this is the other reason that we study Marxism, right? If you read Capital, you'll see that it's in your boss's interest to keep the workers' wages as low as he possibly can so that his surplus will be maximized. And, you know, maybe your coworkers are more friendly to the boss right now, but we've got an economic crisis coming up. We've got a crash coming up where all the bosses are going to be forced to drive down wages and lay off workers and treat workers even more like crap than they do on a normal basis. So just trying to be empathetic towards them, get them to think as a class, and when bad things happen to them at the workplace, show them how this is systemic, right? It's not just an individual problem, it's a systemic problem, and we need to be thinking about these problems collectively as a class. Easier said than done, but I would just recommend read theory and keep building relationships with them. And Sam says, we'll probably stop calling them snakes. That's a good start. I agree. Yeah, try not to be, you know, even though people can be infuriating, try not to get mad at them. Try not to hate them. Understand that they're just brainwashed, even if they say stupid things. And try and treat them with kindness. Thank you so much for the super chat.
And we play video games and we scroll on TikTok. That's literally why these entertainment industries exist and make so much money. They are a cope. A 2016 paper on the structural reasons people...
Exactly. This consumerism is also a cope for alienation. Right? So they're telling people to just be alienated and throw aside all the consumerism, throw aside all the easy dopamine hits. Throw aside everything that you enjoy, everything that you like, so that work will seem a little bit better in comparison.
In low-income neighborhoods struggle with gambling, notes that it represents one of the few actions they can take to address the lack of opportunities and freedoms that they experience. I think what they're calling dopaminergic behavior.
And you can, I mean, just walk into a casino and look around, right? It's not people gambling, especially like the slots. It's not people gambling so they can make money. It's people gambling because they get a dopamine hit, a serotonin hit. Or if they're doing, I said the slots, but if they're doing like blackjack, you know, that's a place where you can be in community with other people. I love playing blackjack actually, because you can sit there and talk to people and meet new people. That's what people enjoy about gambling, the dopamine rush and the community that they get when they're outside of the workplace.
Behaviors have a lot less to do with...
And the key here isn't just to demonize people for partaking in these behaviors, right? The key is to change our system so people actually feel like they have community and they have time to flourish and they have time to do the things that they enjoy, rather than being exploited 40 hours a week to 80 hours a week.
With pleasure seeking and more to do with trying to dissociate from unpleasant social realities. But if you want to get workers to motivate themselves to generate more value and not get mad about their own exploitation, a really great way to do that is to tell them a scientific story about how these behaviors are chemical problems in their individual brains. And the best way to deal with them is not to regulate corporations or give people more social services or change the system in any way, but to
learn resilience, to get in an ice bath. Right? Capitalism will be solved if we all wake up and stare at the sun in an ice bath every morning. Then we'll all enjoy working 60 hours a week instead of being with our families. Andrew Huberman cured capitalism confirmed.
Learn resilience and regulate themselves.
Abso-fruititutely. So shout out to that lady. Go follow her if you're interested in neuroscience. Slugtown. Really appreciate that. That was really, really, really well put together and well researched. She brought up multiple
book is
sources.
essentially
Brought up somebody talking about Palo Alto on Democracy Now. So really, really well done video there. I appreciate them for doing that. And it allowed me to formulate and better concretize a lot of my critiques of Andrew Huberman, because people know I've done pro-Huberman videos. I've done videos about how humans will be able to flourish more under socialism when we have more time, and when we're less exploited and alienated. But and I've implemented some of his things, like the ice bath when I'm feeling down, or I go outside and look at the sun in the morning. Like, these things do help you, you know, produce more dopamine and focus, but it's not the solution to capitalism's problems as it's kind of being pitched as.